What really happened during the Holy Week? A week that changed the world forever, that wasn't revealed to the public eye. We all know the surface story. Jesus enters Jerusalem on a donkey, the crowd shouts, "Hosanna!" He's betrayed, crucified, and then, he rises again on the third day. But what if there is more beneath the surface? What hidden truths and mysterious moments have been missed by history, veiled in the shadows of betrayal, sacrifice, and divine revelation? What did Jesus truly experience in his final days that no one has fully understood? This is not just the story of a man's death and resurrection, it's the revelation of God's greatest plan for humanity, a divine mystery wrapped in pain, love, and triumph. What was Jesus really praying in the Garden of Gethsemane? How did he defeat darkness in a place where no one could see? What does the silence of Holy Saturday truly mean for our faith? Why did Jesus descend into hell, and what did he accomplish there? What did the angels witness when the stone was rolled away? In the next few moments, you will not just hear about the death and resurrection of Jesus, you will uncover the untold story that has remained hidden for over 2,000 years. The real reason why he endured the cross, the unseen spiritual battles that took place in those days, and the profound victory that we are still experiencing today. Hold on tight, because this journey will take you deeper into the heart of the Holy Week than you've ever gone before. The mystery will unfold, and the power of the resurrection will leave you forever changed. If you're ready to discover the untold truths of this Holy Week, share this powerful message with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next life-transforming revelation. The sun began to rise over the ancient city of Jerusalem, casting golden hues across the stone walls and awakening the restless hearts of the people. It was the season of Passover, and the city was swelling with pilgrims from every corner of Judea. Amid the bustling preparations, there was a murmur, an echo of anticipation, weaving through the streets like an approaching storm. Something extraordinary was about to unfold. Far from the noisy crowds, at the village of Bethphage near the Mount of Olives, Jesus stood with his disciples. His gaze was fixed ahead, as if he could see not just the road but destiny itself. He turned to two of his disciples and spoke with gentle authority, "Go into the village ahead of you. Immediately you will find a donkey tied there, and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, tell them that the Lord needs them, and they will let you go." The disciples exchanged glances, their hearts pounding. This was no ordinary errand. They obeyed without question, their minds swirling with curiosity and reverence. As they approached the village, just as Jesus had foretold, they found the donkey and the colt tied near the entrance. A few locals, seeing the strangers untie the animals, stepped forward with suspicion etched across their faces. "What are you doing untying those animals?" one of them demanded, his voice edged with caution. "The Lord needs them," the disciples answered, their voices steady despite their racing hearts. The words, simple yet weighty, seemed to settle over the villagers like a hush of divine recognition. Without protest, they allowed the disciples to take the animals. Leading them back, the disciples felt the gravity of the moment. This act was more than preparation, it was prophecy being fulfilled. Zechariah's words echoed in their minds, "See, your king comes to you, gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." Upon returning, they draped their cloaks over the colt, creating a humble yet royal saddle. Jesus mounted the young colt, his posture regal yet humble, his eyes reflecting both sorrow and determination. As he began his descent from the Mount of Olives, the scene erupted into celebration. Crowds gathered, their excitement boiling over into shouts of joy. Some ran ahead, spreading their cloaks on the road, while others cut branches from the palm trees, waving them high in the air. The atmosphere crackled with fervor as the crowd chanted, "Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord! Hosanna in the highest heaven!" Children joined in, their laughter mixing with the cries of adoration. The noise rolled through the city gates like thunder, drawing even more people to witness the procession. Many had heard of Jesus' miracles, how he had given sight to the blind, raised the dead, and taught with an authority that defied the religious elite. Now, seeing him ride humbly into Jerusalem, They saw the hope of deliverance personified. But not all hearts were lifted by the jubilation. From the shadows of the temple courts and street corners, the Pharisees watched with narrowing eyes. Envy and indignation twisted their faces as they witnessed the swelling tide of adoration directed at Jesus. Whispers of conspiracy slithered among them. "Teacher, rebuke your disciples," one of the Pharisees shouted, unable to mask his irritation. But Jesus, his voice steady and resolute, replied, "I tell you, if they keep quiet, the stones themselves will cry out." His words silenced the accusers momentarily, but their resentment festered beneath their silence. They saw their influence waning with every hosanna that rose into the air. The more the people celebrated, the deeper the Pharisees' jealousy rooted itself. They could not understand how this carpenter from Nazareth, this so-called prophet, could command such devotion. As Jesus approached the city, he paused and gazed upon Jerusalem. Tears welled in his eyes and began to stream down his cheeks. He saw not just the city of stone and tradition but the souls within, blind to the peace he offered. In a voice filled with both lament and longing, he wept, "If you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes." The crowd, still caught up in their joyful clamor, did not fully grasp the weight of his sorrow. They envisioned a Messiah who would overthrow Roman rule and restore Israel's glory. Yet Jesus foresaw the suffering to come, the rejection, the cross. Still, he continued forward, the colt's hooves softly clopping against the paved road as palm branches crackled underfoot. The crowd swelled even larger as he entered the city gates. Every step was heavy with prophecy, every shout of "Hosanna," a bittersweet chorus echoing toward the inevitable. Thus began the Holy Week, a journey set in motion not by chance, but by divine orchestration. Behind the celebration loomed the shadow of the cross, but for this moment, the king had arrived, greeted not by royal fanfare but by the praises of the humble and hopeful. The tension in the air was unmistakable. What began as a jubilant procession had planted seeds of both hope and hostility. Unseen forces were at work, setting the stage for the drama that would unfold in the days to come. The sun dawned with a deceptive calm over Jerusalem on Holy Monday. The city, still humming from the electric atmosphere of the previous day, stirred once more to life. Traders unfurled their goods, the clink of coins began echoing in temple courtyards, and the aroma of spices filled the cool morning air. But beneath the surface of everyday bustle, tension coiled tightly like a serpent ready to strike. Jesus, accompanied by his disciples, approached the great temple, the very heart of Jewish worship and identity. From a distance, the towering structure gleamed in the sunlight, its white stones and golden trim a proud symbol of the covenant. Yet, as they drew closer, a shadow darkened Jesus' face. His eyes, usually filled with gentleness, now reflected a storm gathering within his soul. The outer courts of the temple were overrun with merchants and money changers. Tables were laden with coins of every currency, and cages of doves rattled as they awaited sale for sacrifices. Voices barked prices, animals bleated in distress, and pilgrims, eager to fulfill their religious duties, bargained for offerings. But what was meant to be a house of prayer had been turned into a chaotic marketplace. Greed hung in the air like a stifling fog. Jesus' chest rose and fell, his heart pounding with righteous indignation. He stepped into the courtyard, and the clamor began to hush, as if creation itself held its breath. Without hesitation, he seized a length of rope and fashioned it into a whip. The moment the first crack of the whip resounded, panic swept across the courtyard. "Get these out of here!" Jesus thundered, his voice filled with authority that shook the very stones beneath their feet. "Stop turning my Father's house into a den of thieves." Tables crashed to the ground as he overturned them with decisive fury, coins scattering like sparks from a fire. Doves burst free from their cages, wings beating the air frantically as they soared into the sky. Merchants scrambled, their faces pale with terror and disbelief. No one dared to stand in his way. The disciples watched, their hearts racing. They had seen his compassion, his miracles, his wisdom, but never had they witnessed such raw, holy wrath. And yet, in that moment, they remembered the words of the psalmist, Zeal for your house will consume me." Onlookers froze, unsure whether to flee or to fall to their knees. The temple priests, dressed in their fine robes, stood at a distance, their faces twisted in indignation. Their lucrative operations were being dismantled before their very eyes. Behind their outrage, however, flickered something darker: fear. This man, this teacher from Galilee, was not just a preacher of peace. He was a force that threatened to upend their carefully constructed power. After the cleansing, Jesus stood amidst the wreckage, his chest heaving, his eyes blazing yet filled with sorrow. He gazed at the temple, this house that was meant to be holy, meant to draw men closer to God, and his heart ached for what it had become. But he did not leave immediately. Instead, he began to teach those who remained, his voice calm but heavy with authority. "It is written," he declared, "My house will be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers." The blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. Children, unafraid and innocent, began to cry out in the courts, "Hosanna to the Son of David." Their voices, pure and joyful, rose above the noise, proclaiming truth that even the scholars refused to see. The chief priests and scribes, fuming with envy, confronted him. "Do you hear what these children are saying?" they demanded. Jesus met their gaze with unwavering calm. "Yes," he replied. "Have you never read, 'From the lips of children and infants, you, Lord, have called forth your praise'?" The tension in the temple swirled like a brewing storm. The religious leaders retreated, their minds already plotting. They had tolerated his teachings in the countryside, but this was a direct challenge to their authority in the very seat of their power. Fury and fear twisted within them, feeding the dark desires of their hearts. As the day drew to a close, Jesus, his disciples following closely behind, left the temple courts. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across Jerusalem. But the fire he had ignited would not be easily extinguished. Whispers spread through the city streets like wildfire. Who was this man who dared to cleanse the temple? Could he truly be the promised Messiah? Nightfall settled over Jerusalem, but in the hidden chambers of power, hearts burned with envy and plans of betrayal began to take root. Holy Monday ended not with peace, but with the simmering promise of confrontation. The stage was set. The days ahead would tremble under the weight of destiny. Morning light broke over Jerusalem with a sense of ominous urgency. Holy Tuesday had arrived, and though the temple courts had been cleared of their merchants and money changers the day before, the air remained thick with unease. The religious leaders, humiliated and furious, regrouped in secret chambers, plotting their next move. They could not allow this Galilean teacher to undermine their authority any longer. Jesus returned to the temple, his steps steady and unafraid. The crowds were even larger now, drawn by rumors of his fierce confrontation the day before. Pilgrims, seekers, and skeptics alike pressed close, eager for his words. But in the shadows, the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Herodians waited, sharpening their questions like weapons. Today they would try to trap him. As Jesus began to teach, his voice carried powerfully across the courtyard. He spoke in parables, each story like an arrow aimed at the hearts of his listeners. A man planted a vineyard. He began, and the crowd leaned in. He wove a tale of tenants who rebelled against their master, beating and killing the servants he sent to collect his due. Finally, the master sent his beloved son, but the tenants killed him too, hoping to seize the inheritance. The listeners felt a chill. The meaning was clear. Jesus was speaking of Israel's leaders, who had rejected God's messengers and were now plotting against the very Son of God himself. Fury burned in the eyes of the Pharisees. They stepped forward, their voices laced with false politeness. "Teacher," one of them began, holding up a silver coin that gleamed in the sunlight, "is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" It was a trap. If Jesus said yes, he would anger the people who despised Roman oppression. If he said no, they could accuse him of rebellion against Caesar. But Jesus, unshaken, took the coin and held it up for all to see. "Whose image is this?" he asked. "Caesar's," they replied, their smugness faltering. "Then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's," Jesus declared, and to God the things that are God's." A murmur of awe swept through the crowd. The trap had sprung, but Jesus had slipped through its teeth effortlessly. But the religious leaders were relentless. Next came the Sadducees, who denied the resurrection. They posed a convoluted question about a woman who married 7 brothers in succession, each dying without leaving children. In the resurrection, they sneered, "Whose wife will she be?" Jesus met their question with piercing clarity. "You are in error because you do not know the Scriptures or the power of God," he answered. He spoke of life beyond death, of a resurrection where the bonds of earthly marriage no longer bound souls. The Sadducees fell silent, defeated. Yet, the tension in the temple did not fade. If anything, it deepened, like the gathering clouds of an approaching storm. Then came a scribe, less hostile but still testing. "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" Without hesitation, Jesus replied, his voice filled with unwavering conviction, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself." The crowd felt the weight of his words settle upon them. Simple, yet profound. The essence of the law and the prophets distilled into 2 commands. But as the leaders recoiled from their failed traps, Jesus turned the tables. He questioned them in return about the Messiah. "Whose son is he?" They answered, "The son of David." Then Jesus pressed further, quoting the Psalms, "If David calls him Lord, how can he be his son?" No one dared answer. Silence cloaked the temple courts. Seizing the moment, Jesus spoke with fierce authority, condemning the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. He pronounced 7 woes upon them, each accusation cutting deep. They shut the door of the kingdom in people's faces, they exploited widows, they craved recognition while their hearts were corrupt. "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites!" His voice thundered across the courtyard. "You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside but on the inside are full of the bones of the dead." Gasps rippled through the listeners. The tension was almost unbearable. Every word he spoke exposed the rot beneath the surface of the religious elite's piety. As the day wore on, Jesus led his disciples away from the temple, the sun casting long shadows across the city. On the Mount of Olives, overlooking Jerusalem, he sat with them privately. The temple, still gleaming in the distance, seemed invincible, but Jesus saw its doom. "Do you see all these things?" he asked his disciples. "Truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another, every one will be thrown down." The disciples, troubled, pressed for more. When would these things happen? What would be the sign of his coming and the end of the age? Jesus spoke of wars and rumors of wars, of nations rising against nations, of famines and earthquakes, the beginning of birth pains. He warned of persecution, betrayal, and false prophets. Yet, amidst the foreboding prophecies, he offered a glimmer of hope. But the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. Nightfall crept over Jerusalem as he continued to reveal mysteries of the end times, the coming tribulation, the darkened sun, the gathering of the elect. His voice, though solemn, carried a thread of promise. The Son of Man would return in glory. As they descended the mount, an uneasy silence hung over the group. The weight of the day's revelations pressed upon their hearts. The storm was coming, closer than ever. The leaders had failed to trap him today, but their hatred was boiling to the surface. Very soon they would strike. And Jesus, calm, resolute, walked into the shadows of the gathering night, fully aware of what lay ahead. Spy Wednesday, the price of betrayal. The sun over Jerusalem seemed dimmer on this day, as though the heavens themselves foresaw the darkness creeping closer. It was midweek, and tension had grown so thick in the city it felt as if it might crack under its weight. Whispers twisted through the alleys and temple courts, shadows lengthened, and fear clawed at the hearts of many. In the private chambers of the chief priests and elders, schemes unfurled like venomous serpents. The failed confrontations in the temple had only deepened their rage. Jesus had silenced their cleverest traps, exposed their hypocrisy, and now the people hung on his every word. If they didn't act soon, their authority, their very survival would be at risk. But how could they reach him? Crowds surrounded him daily, protective and loyal. Arresting him publicly could spark a riot, and they feared the backlash of the people more than they feared breaking their own laws. Then, like a sinister answer to their prayers, an unexpected visitor approached. Judas Iscariot, one of the 12. The moment he stepped into their gathering, a wicked glimmer sparked in the eyes of the religious leaders. Here was their way in, a doorway into Jesus' inner circle. Judas's eyes were restless, shifting between greed and guilt, though he tried to mask his turmoil under a veil of indifference. "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him to you?" Judas asked, his voice low, almost hoarse. Without hesitation, they weighed out 30 silver coins, the grim price of betrayal. The sound of the silver clinking into his palms seemed to echo endlessly in Judas's mind. It was a sound that would haunt him far more than he could ever imagine. As Judas pocketed the coins, he melted back into the streets of Jerusalem, a marked man. Though he walked among the crowds and laughed with the other disciples, inside, shadows gnawed at his soul. Elsewhere, Jesus continued his teachings, fully aware of the storm rising around him. He spoke of coming trials, of persecution, of endurance in the face of betrayal. His words were somber, prophetic, yet laced with an unshakable hope. "You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed," he warned his disciples. "Such things must happen, but the end is still to come." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the city seemed to hold its breath. Behind smiling faces and religious rituals, betrayal festered in the shadows. Judas had set his path, and the wheels of conspiracy turned relentlessly onward. Spy Wednesday ended not with triumph, but with a chilling quiet, the stillness before the tempest. Maundy Thursday, the final supper and the shadows of betrayal. Evening crept over Jerusalem, cloaking the city in a cool hush that felt like the calm before an inevitable storm. The city, still alive with preparations for the Passover feast, buzzed with pilgrims lighting their lamps and families gathering to remember the great deliverance from Egypt. Yet, in an upper room tucked away from the noise, a far more profound deliverance was quietly unfolding. Jesus, knowing his hour had come, instructed his disciples to prepare the Passover meal. "Go into the city," he had told them earlier, "and you will meet a man carrying a jar of water. Follow him." True to his word, they found the man, and he led them to a large, furnished upper room. It was there that the final meal would take place, a supper unlike any other. As the disciples gathered, the atmosphere was thick with an unspoken tension. They sensed the weight of the moment but could not fully grasp its magnitude. Jesus moved among them with quiet authority, his eyes reflecting both sorrow and love. Then, in a gesture that left them stunned, he wrapped a towel around his waist, poured water into a basin, and began to wash their feet. Silence fell heavy over the room. The Master, the one they called Lord, stooping to wash the dirt from their feet? Peter, always the outspoken one, recoiled. "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" His voice trembled with disbelief. Jesus answered softly yet firmly, "You do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand." One by one, he washed them clean, even Judas, whose heart, by now, was a storm of conflict and treachery. It was a final lesson in humility, a silent sermon on servanthood. But the moment was soon overshadowed by darker words. As they reclined at the table, breaking bread and sharing the cup, Jesus' voice grew somber. "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me." The room seemed to freeze in time. The disciples exchanged bewildered glances, their hearts pounding. "Surely not I, Lord," each one protested, their voices tight with fear. Jesus dipped the bread and handed it to Judas. "What you are about to do quickly," he said. Judas, his face pale under the flickering lamplight, stood and hurried into the night. Outside, darkness swallowed him whole. The door shut behind him with a finality that rang louder than any words. With Judas gone, Jesus spoke again, but this time his words were filled with aching tenderness and urgency. He broke the bread and gave it to them. "Take and eat, this is my body." Then he took the cup, blessed it, and passed it around. Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." The disciples partook, their hearts heavy but unaware of just how soon these symbols would become reality. After the meal, they sang a hymn, a bittersweet melody that filled the quiet corners of the upper room, and then Jesus led them out into the night toward the Mount of Olives. The air was cool, and the sky was scattered with restless clouds, as if the heavens themselves were anxious. Along the way, Jesus warned them, "This very night you will all fall away on account of me." Peter, fierce and loyal, protested immediately, "Even if all fall away, I never will." But Jesus, with a knowing sadness, replied, "Truly I tell you, this very night, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. Peter shook his head vehemently, but fear had already begun to gnaw at the edges of his resolve. They reached the Garden of Gethsemane, a place of quiet olive trees and familiar prayer. Jesus' face, illuminated by the faint moonlight, was etched with deep sorrow. "Sit here while I go over there and pray," he instructed. Taking Peter, James, and John further with him, he confessed, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." Then, falling to his knees, he prayed with an intensity that shook the night. "Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will." His sweat fell like great drops of blood upon the earth. But when he returned to his disciples, he found them asleep, their eyes heavy with sorrow. "Could you not keep watch with me for 1 hour?" he asked Peter softly. Before they could respond, a flicker of torchlight appeared in the distance. Shadows moved through the garden, soldiers, priests, and Judas leading them. The betrayer stepped forward, his face a mask of resolve and guilt. He greeted Jesus with a kiss, the signal he had arranged. "Greetings, Rabbi," Judas said. Jesus, with unyielding calm, replied, "Friend, do what you came for." Swords were drawn, and chaos erupted in the quiet garden. Peter, in a surge of fury, struck the ear of the high priest's servant, cutting it clean off. But Jesus intervened swiftly. "Put your sword back in its place," he commanded, and with a gentle touch, he healed the wounded man. As the soldiers bound him and led him away, his disciples fled into the shadows, fear clutching their hearts. The night swallowed them whole, and the first act of the great and terrible sacrifice had begun. The trial before the Sanhedrin, false accusations and denial. The air was thick with tension as the chill of night seemed to stretch endlessly into the early hours of the morning. The dark streets of Jerusalem lay empty and silent, save for the occasional flicker of torchlight that cast long, haunting shadows across the stone walls. Inside the courtyard of the high priest, Caiaphas, the scene was starkly different. The courtyard buzzed with hushed voices, clanging armor, and the shuffle of feet as the leaders of the Jewish council had gathered, but the true purpose of this gathering was far darker than any they could admit. Jesus had been bound and brought to the high priest's palace under cover of darkness. He had been betrayed with a kiss, arrested in the garden, and now he was being dragged into the lion's den, the very ones who had sought his death since the beginning of his ministry. These religious leaders, fearful and envious of his power, sought to discredit him, to twist his words, to find any charge that would lead to his condemnation. As the false accusations began to swirl in the dimly lit courtyard, the scene grew more tense by the moment. The Sanhedrin, the council of the chief priests, elders, and teachers of the law, sat in a half-circle, their faces hardened with judgment, their eyes fixed on the prisoners standing before them. But their attempts to find false witnesses, those who could speak against Jesus and offer fabricated testimony, fell flat. The witnesses who were brought forward contradicted each other. Their testimony was so clearly false that even the angry murmurs of the council were mixed with confusion. The tension mounted as the high priest, desperate for a way to condemn Jesus, turned to him. "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" Caiaphas demanded, his voice cutting through the confusion like a dagger. Jesus, standing tall in his chains, looked the high priest directly in the eyes. The room fell silent, the air thick with the weight of the question. Then, in a voice that was calm yet unwavering, he replied, "I am." And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." A gasp swept through the crowd. Caiaphas tore his robes in dramatic outrage, declaring, "Why do we need any more witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" The council, eager for blood, quickly condemned him. "He is worthy of death," they cried in unison. The reality of Jesus' words was too much for them to bear. He had just declared himself the fulfillment of prophecy, and the Jewish leaders, blind to the truth of who he was, could only see it as blasphemy. They mocked him, spat in his face, and struck him with their fists. The room rang with jeers and insults, each blow a step closer to the inevitable, the cross. Meanwhile, outside, another scene was unfolding, one filled with fear, guilt, and the crushing weight of denial. Peter, the most loyal of Jesus' disciples, had followed at a distance, watching from the shadows. He had vowed that he would never abandon Jesus, but fear gnawed at his resolve as the trial continued inside the courtyard. A servant girl, noticing Peter, stepped forward and said, "You also were with Jesus of Galilee." Peter's heart raced. He knew that the heat of the moment would destroy him, and he was terrified of being arrested as well. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice shaky as he quickly moved to the outer part of the courtyard. But the accusation didn't stop there. Another servant girl noticed Peter and said to those standing around, "This fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth." Peter, now more agitated, denied it with an oath. "I don't know the man." As the night wore on and the trial raged inside, the pressure outside mounted. Someone else, noticing Peter's Galilean accent, pointed to him and said, "Surely you are one of them, your accent gives you away." Peter, now filled with fear, began to call down curses and swore to them, "I don't know the man." And just as the words left his mouth, the rooster crowed. The sound of the rooster's call pierced the courtyard, breaking through the chaos. Peter's heart stopped, and his eyes met the gaze of Jesus, who was being led from the courtroom, bound and bloodied from the abuse he had suffered. The weight of his gaze was enough to shatter Peter's world. In that moment, the full extent of Peter's betrayal hit him. He remembered the words Jesus had spoken earlier, "Before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times." The pain of it washed over him like a wave, and he ran out into the night, weeping bitterly, his heart broken by the reality of his failure. Inside, Jesus stood silently as the religious leaders continued their mockery. But he knew that the path to the cross was set. The plan of salvation was in motion, and nothing, not the false trials, the betrayals, or the denials, could stop what had to be done. The weight of the sin of the world would soon be placed upon him. The trial before Pilate, the injustice of the king's condemnation. The sun had barely risen when the first light of dawn crept over the city of Jerusalem, casting a golden glow over the stone streets. The trial of Jesus, a mockery of justice, continued to unfold. He had already been subjected to the cruel treatment of the Jewish Sanhedrin, but now he was about to stand before the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, in the heart of the governor's residence. The streets were eerily quiet, but the tension that hung in the air was suffocating. Jesus, still bound and weary from the abuse, was led by a group of temple guards into the governor's hall. Pilate, who had been woken from his sleep to deal with this matter, was a man accustomed to the ways of Roman law and politics. He sat in judgment on the elevated seat of authority, his face cold, impassive. He was no stranger to dealing with troublemakers, yet something about this case unsettled him. The religious leaders, brimming with self-righteous indignation, pressed forward, their voices loud and accusatory as they brought Jesus before Pilate. They wasted no time in presenting their case. "We have found this man subverting our nation," one of the accusers began. "He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar and claims to be the Messiah, a king." Pilate's eyes flicked over to Jesus. The charge was serious. A claim to be a king could mean insurrection against Rome. He looked at the man before him, battered and bloodied, and something in his calmness stirred doubt in Pilate's mind. Pilate was a pragmatic man, not one easily swayed by political or religious squabbles. But this Jesus was different. He had heard rumors, stories of miracles, healings, and teachings that challenged the status quo. What kind of man was this? Are you the king of the Jews? Pilate asked bluntly, his voice filled with suspicion. Jesus, with a calm that contrasted sharply with the chaos around him, replied, "You have said so." Pilate turned to the chief priests and the crowd. "I find no basis for a charge against this man," he declared, his voice carrying through the room. But the crowd was relentless, their cries growing louder, demanding Jesus' execution. The religious leaders, sensing victory, stirred the crowd with accusations that Jesus had stirred up the people with his radical teachings from Galilee to Judea. At the mention of Galilee, Pilate saw a glimmer of opportunity. If Jesus was from Galilee, then he was under the jurisdiction of Herod Antipas, the ruler of that region. Pilate, eager to shift the responsibility, sent Jesus to Herod, hoping that the man would deal with this matter in a way that would allow Pilate to avoid making a difficult decision. Herod, like Pilate, was curious about this Jesus, though not in a way that sought truth or justice. He had heard of the miracles and wanted to see Jesus perform some signs, hoping to be entertained. But Jesus remained silent before him, offering no response to Herod's questions. The king, frustrated by the lack of spectacle, mocked Jesus, dressing him in a royal robe and sending him back to Pilate with a mocking sneer. When Jesus returned, Pilate was faced with a new dilemma. The crowd had grown even more agitated, their demands for blood growing louder. Pilate tried again to release Jesus, knowing deep down that he had done nothing wrong. But as the crowd's cries of "Crucify him" filled the air, Pilate's heart grew heavier with dread. He was caught in a political storm. He knew the price of not appeasing the masses and the dangers of angering the Jewish leadership. In an attempt to free himself from responsibility, Pilate offered a choice to the people. It was the custom at the Passover festival to release one prisoner, a symbol of mercy. He stood before them, presenting Jesus and Barabbas, a notorious rebel and murderer. Surely, the crowd would choose Jesus, the innocent teacher, over the violent insurgent. But the chief priests had worked their influence, and when Pilate asked, "Which of these two do you want me to release to you?" the crowd shouted, "Barabbas." Pilate was stunned. "What shall I do then with Jesus who is called the Messiah?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Crucify him," the crowd roared, their voices filled with hate and fervor. Pilate's heart sank, but he had no choice. He washed his hands before them, a symbolic gesture meant to absolve himself of the responsibility. "I am innocent of this man's blood," he said, his voice hollow. "It is your responsibility." With that, the crowd's jeers filled the air, and Pilate, out of political cowardice and fear, handed Jesus over to be flogged and crucified. The scourging and the crown, the king mocked before the cross. The sentence was passed. The righteous one, who had healed the sick, raised the dead, and spoke words of life, was now condemned to the most brutal punishment known to the Roman world, crucifixion. But before Jesus could be led away to die, he would be subjected to something even more dehumanizing, the scourging. In the inner courtyard of the Roman barracks, Jesus was stripped of his garments and tied to a pillar. The Roman soldiers assigned to carry out the punishment were seasoned men, brutal, indifferent to pain, and desensitized to the pleas of the condemned. They were executioners, not thinkers. To them, Jesus was no different from the many criminals who passed through their hands. But there was something twisted in the way they took special delight in mocking him. The scourge they used was no ordinary whip. It was a flagrum, a short-handled instrument with leather straps embedded with sharp pieces of bone, metal, and glass. Each lash tore through Jesus' back, opening flesh, exposing muscles, and drawing blood with every cruel strike. The courtyard echoed with the crack of the whip and the muffled gasps of witnesses who couldn't bear to watch. Jesus didn't cry out. Though his body convulsed with each strike, his lips remained sealed. Every stripe that landed on his body was prophecy fulfilled. "By his stripes we are healed." When the soldiers had exhausted their cruelty, they untied him and allowed his beaten body to fall to the ground. But they weren't finished. They had heard the accusations. "He says he is the king of the Jews." To them, it was a joke that needed mockery. A cruel game. They threw a faded, torn robe of purple over his bleeding shoulders, a parody of royal majesty. Someone twisted together a crown made of long, hard thorns and forced it onto his head, piercing his scalp. Blood streamed down his face, mingling with sweat and dust. They handed him a reed, a mock scepter, and knelt before him in exaggerated bows. "Hail, King of the Jews!" they laughed, slapping him in the face. Some spat on him, while others struck him with the very reed they had mockingly placed in his hand. This was no longer just punishment. It was a public humiliation, designed to strip him of every ounce of dignity. Yet, Jesus didn't retaliate. He didn't speak a word in his defense. He bore the mockery, the cruelty, the shame, for a greater purpose. Each insult, each blow, each drop of blood had meaning. He was carrying the weight of sin before he even touched the cross. When the soldiers grew tired of their savage entertainment, they ripped the purple robe off his body, reopening the wounds that had begun to clot. They placed his own garments back on him and forced him to his feet. It was time. The road to Calvary awaited. A heavy wooden crossbeam was laid across his shoulders, digging into his torn flesh. His legs shook beneath the weight. The Via Dolorosa, the way of sorrow, stretched ahead, winding through the narrow, crowded streets of Jerusalem. People lined the roads, some watching with tears, others with scorn. Among the crowd were those who had once followed him, now frozen in horror. Jesus stumbled under the weight. Blood and sweat poured from his brow, blinding his eyes. He collapsed more than once. The Roman centurion in charge grew impatient. The crucifixion must proceed. They had no time to waste. So they seized a man from the crowd, Simon of Cyrene, a traveler, and forced him to carry the cross behind Jesus. Simon had no idea that day he would be part of prophecy. With trembling hands, he bore the instrument of execution, walking behind the suffering Savior. As they made their way through the city, women wept aloud. Jesus, though staggering, turned to them. His voice was weak but clear. "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children." Even in his agony, his heart broke for others. At last, they reached Golgotha, the place of the skull. The final stage of humiliation had arrived. But even now, heaven held its breath. The Lamb was nearing the altar. The crucifixion, when heaven turned away. The hill of Golgotha loomed like a cursed throne above Jerusalem, a rocky outcrop shaped like a skull, barren, hard, and silent. The place chosen for executions. Death had made its home there, and now it waited for the arrival of the only sinless man to ever walk the earth. Jesus was thrown down onto the rough wood of the cross. The same hands that had touched lepers, lifted children, and calmed storms were now spread wide and pinned to timber. Roman executioners moved with mechanical precision. A hammer was raised. A spike was positioned at the wrist, not through the palms as art would later depict, but through the nerve centers near the base of the hand, ensuring maximum pain. With brutal force, the iron was driven in. He didn't scream. Another spike was hammered into the other wrist. Then his feet were twisted together, bent at the knee, and another long nail driven through bone and sinew. Every strike echoed like thunder in the spirit realm. The Lamb was being nailed to the altar of God. Once secured, the soldiers raised the cross and dropped it into a hole in the ground. The weight of Jesus' body tore against the nails, dislocating joints, crushing nerves. Hanging there, his lungs began to collapse. Every breath required him to push up on the nail in his feet, scraping his shredded back against the splintered wood. Breathing was torture. Living was agony. Above his head, a sign had been nailed. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, a declaration for all to read. The chief priests had protested. Change it to say, "He claimed to be king," they told Pilate. But Pilate, in defiance or guilt, refused. "What I have written, I have written." Beneath the cross, the soldiers cast lots for his clothing. They laughed, joked, and gambled over the garments of the dying Savior, fulfilling prophecy. "They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." On either side of Jesus, two criminals were also crucified. One mocked him, saying, "If you are the Christ, save yourself and us." But the other, broken, repentant, rebuked the first, and turned to Jesus, saying, "Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And then came a whisper from the King of Glory, hanging in agony. "Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." Even on the cross, mercy was flowing. At the foot of the cross stood Mary, his mother. Her heart was pierced with pain only a mother could understand. Beside her stood John, the beloved disciple. Jesus, gasping for air, looked down at them and said, "Woman, behold your son." Then to John, "Behold your mother." Even in suffering, he provided for her. Then from the darkness came words that shook heaven and earth. "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani?" My God, why have you forsaken me?" The sky had grown dark, unnaturally so, from the 6th hour to the 9th. Not a cloud, but a darkness that came from the depths of judgment. The Father had turned away. The weight of the world's sin now lay upon Jesus. The Holy One became sin. Heaven closed its eyes. He cried out again, "I thirst." A soldier lifted a sponge soaked in sour wine on a hyssop branch, a symbolic echo of the Passover, and offered it to him. And then, with a voice stronger than any expected from a dying man, Jesus cried, "It is finished." Not a whimper of defeat, but a declaration of victory. The debt was paid. The wrath was satisfied. The veil between God and man had been torn. Then he whispered the final words, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And he breathed his last. The earth could no longer remain still. The ground trembled. Rocks split open. Tombs cracked. The veil in the temple, the thick curtain separating man from the Holy of Holies, was torn in two from top to bottom. Not by man's hands, but by God's. A Roman centurion, watching the sky darken and the ground quake, fell to his knees and declared, "Truly, this was the Son of God." And all of creation groaned. The Savior was dead. But his death had broken the curse. Hope was buried that day, but only for a time. The burial and the guarded tomb, when hope was sealed away. The sun had already begun to set, casting a sorrowful golden hue over Jerusalem. It was the day of preparation, and the Sabbath was fast approaching. Jewish law forbade the bodies of the condemned to remain on the cross after sundown. Yet the mangled, lifeless body of Jesus still hung there, the Lamb of God, crucified, shamed, and silent. As the crowd dispersed and the echoes of the crucifixion faded into the streets, two unlikely men came forward. Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the Sanhedrin and a secret follower of Jesus, stepped into the dangerous light. Though his peers had condemned the Christ, Joseph now chose to honor him in death. He went boldly to Pilate and requested the body. Pilate was surprised. "Is he already dead?" he asked. Crucifixion often dragged on for days. He summoned the centurion to confirm. When the soldier nodded solemnly, Pilate granted the body to Joseph. The request alone was an act of courage. Joseph was putting his reputation, his wealth, and his position on the line. But something in him knew, this was no ordinary death. This was prophecy unfolding. Joseph wasn't alone. Another secret follower stepped out from the shadows, Nicodemus, the Pharisee who had once visited Jesus by night, asking about being born again. He came now with a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds in all, an extravagant, kingly burial offering. The two men carefully took Jesus' broken body down from the cross. His head lolled to the side. His skin was pale and bloodied, his limbs stiffening. They wrapped him in fine linen strips, soaked with the spices. The scent of myrrh lingered in the air, mingling with the heavy silence of grief. Carefully, they worked, not as men preparing a body for burial, but as servants attending to their king. Nearby, Joseph had a new tomb carved into solid rock, untouched by death until now. It was in a quiet garden, not far from Golgotha. There they carried Jesus and laid him on the cold stone slab. The tomb was sealed not with nails, but with grief and trembling reverence. A large, circular stone was rolled over the entrance. It was heavy, meant to keep animals and grave robbers away. But there were darker threats ahead. The next morning, the chief priests and Pharisees gathered before Pilate, their fear barely contained. "Sir, They said, "We remember how that deceiver said, while he was alive, 'After 3 days I will rise again.'" They didn't believe in his resurrection, but they feared what his followers might do. "Command that the tomb be made secure until the 3rd day," they urged. "Otherwise, his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people that he has risen." Pilate, weary and dismissive, replied, "You have a guard. Go, make it as secure as you know how." And so they did. Roman soldiers, hardened men of war, were stationed at the tomb. A Roman seal was placed upon the stone, a warning to any who dared disturb it. Breaking the seal was punishable by death. The soldiers stood watch through the night, spears in hand, eyes scanning the shadows. And inside that tomb, the body of the Son of God lay still. The air was thick with grief. For his followers, the world had collapsed. Their Messiah was gone. Their hope buried. Their faith shaken. The disciples scattered in hiding, unsure if they were next. Peter wept bitterly. Mary, the mother of Jesus, mourned in silence. The women who had followed him sat by the tomb, stunned and shattered. The kingdom he spoke of had not come, at least not in the way they expected. And the enemy rejoiced. But deep beneath the veil of silence, heaven was preparing something no one could see. The silence of that tomb was not defeat. It was the pause before the most explosive victory in eternity. Because the grave had never held someone like him before. The sun rose over Jerusalem with a hollow stillness. The city, once roaring with chants of "Hosanna" and later "Crucify him," was eerily silent. It was Sabbath, the day of rest. But this Sabbath felt different. It was not sacred silence, it was haunted. No bird dared to sing over Golgotha. The air itself seemed afraid to move, as though the weight of what had happened the day before had bruised even the skies. Inside a shuttered upper room, the disciples huddled together in a haze of fear and disbelief. They did not speak much. No one knew what to say. Peter, still haunted by the sound of the rooster and his third denial, sat apart from the rest, burying his face in his hands. John, the only one who had dared to stand at the foot of the cross, stared blankly at the floor. Thomas paced silently. Each man was wrestling with questions they couldn't ask aloud. Was he really the Messiah? How could the Son of God die? Are we next? Outside their hiding place, the women who had followed Jesus mourned in silence. Mary Magdalene, Salome, Joanna, and Mary the mother of James sat near the sealed tomb, their eyes swollen, their clothes still streaked with dust and dried tears. The memory of Jesus' body being wrapped hurriedly and laid to rest lingered like a thorn in their minds. There hadn't been enough time. Not enough spices. Not enough reverence. They wanted to do more, but the Sabbath law forbade it. So they waited, aching for dawn. But the world above knew only part of the story. Beneath the earth, in realms unseen by human eyes, something far more cosmic was unfolding. The spiritual realm was in a violent tremor. Hell, for a moment, erupted in twisted celebration. The demonic hosts reveled in what they believed was their victory. Satan himself stood, not on a throne of fire, but on delusion. He had seen the nails pierce through divinity. He had watched the blood fall from the cross. He had heard the final words, "It is finished." But he did not understand what they truly meant. He mistook surrender for defeat. He mocked. He roared. The gates of darkness swung open with celebration. The demons danced, thinking heaven had lost its greatest son. But in the silence of that Saturday, a sound began to rise, not one of celebration, but of trembling. The enemy, confident as ever, did not yet feel it, but the grave was shaking. The king was not abandoned. The blood had not been spilled in vain. The silence was not the end, it was the countdown. In heaven, the angelic host stood still. Not even a wing moved. All of heaven watched the sealed tomb like watchers of a battlefield waiting for the trumpet to blow. The angels who had announced his birth now stood silent, gripping their swords, not in mourning, but in anticipation. And God the Father, enthroned in radiant mystery, looked upon the grave of his Son with divine intention. The silence of heaven was not confusion. It was not grief. It was preparation. The covenant made before the foundation of the world was about to unfold in full. The Lion of Judah was not dead. He was descending into the deepest parts of darkness to claim what belonged to him. In that Sabbath silence, no one knew what was happening beneath the surface. Not the Roman guards stationed at the tomb, shifting uncomfortably. Not the Pharisees, who slept uneasily despite their manipulation and lies. Not even the disciples, still paralyzed by confusion and fear. But hope was hidden in the silence. Because the promise had always been 3 days. Not 1. Not 2. 3. And as the women grieved and the disciples trembled, as demons laughed and angels watched, as Satan roared and the tomb remained still, the King was at work in the unseen. The day of silence was not empty. It was sacred. It was the stillness before resurrection. Descent into darkness, when Jesus confronted the gates of hell. The world above was wrapped in silence. The tomb still held his lifeless body, still, untouched and sealed. But in the realm unseen by mortal eyes, all creation held its breath. When Jesus exhaled his last breath on the cross, something tore deeper than the veil of the temple. It was not the end of him. It was the beginning of his descent into the depths. Not in defeat, but in divine authority. He was not a victim. He was a king marching into enemy territory. In the depths of Sheol, the place of the dead, a tremor began to shake. The gates of hell, forged in pride and rebellion, rattled under a force they had never known before. And then, light pierced the gloom. The light of the world was stepping in where darkness thought it reigned. Lucifer, once the highest of angels, now twisted in eternal hatred, felt the tremble before the king even arrived. Hell had never been afraid. Until now. What is this power? Who dares to enter here? Jesus did not answer with words. His presence was the answer. The King of Kings entered Hades, not as a chained prisoner, but as a conquering general. Around him, the souls of the righteous, the faithful who had awaited the fulfillment of promise, lifted their eyes. Abraham, David, Isaiah, Elijah, the prophets, the patriarchs, the martyrs. They had spoken of this moment without seeing it in their lifetimes. Now they beheld it with their own eyes. The Messiah had come, not to preach, but to break the hold of death itself. He descended not just into hell, but into the very courtroom of spiritual injustice. And there, in that cosmic court, he stood before Satan and the spirit of death. The wages of sin is death, death growled. And now you are mine. But Jesus stepped forward, his voice like thunder wrapped in flame. I have paid it in full. Their debt is cancelled. And I hold the receipt. And then he stretched out his hand. Upon it were the wounds of the cross. The scars that spoke louder than accusation. Blood had touched the mercy seat, and justice had been satisfied. The devil, once roaring in triumph at the cross, now shrieked in fury. But there was nothing he could do. The keys were being taken. The keys of death. The keys of hell. He couldn't stop him. He had no claim. The serpent's head had been crushed by a wounded heel. And then, a rumble began. Not on earth, but in that unseen place. The stone covering the tomb was rolling away. Not by mortal hands, but by divine order. An angel, gleaming like lightning, descended and flung it aside like paper. Not to let Jesus escape, but to let the world witness the empty grave. Heaven and earth aligned. Jesus turned to the faithful souls behind him. Come, he said. It is finished. The way is open. And like a procession of triumph, he led them upward, a train of captives once bound but now free. This was the moment Psalm 24 had prophesied. Lift up your heads, O gates. Be lifted, ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. Heaven answered its own question. Who is this King of glory? The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. The resurrected Jesus ascended from the depths, his glory now unstoppable. He was headed back to the tomb, not to lie down, but to rise up. And above, the sun began to rise, just as the Son of God stepped into the world of the living again, resurrected, radiant, and victorious. The stone was rolled away. But hell had already been broken. Resurrection morning, when death lost its sting. Early dawn. Jerusalem. The city, still wrapped in the sleepy haze of the Sabbath's end, had no idea the world was about to change forever. The first day of the week had arrived. The sky still carried the pale gray of morning when the women, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome, hurried through the narrow streets, their hands trembling as they clutched jars of spices. They weren't running in hope. They were running in devotion. They expected to find a tomb sealed and a corpse needing care. Their grief had not yet made room for faith. But even as they whispered, "Who will roll away the stone for us?" the earth answered with a tremor. A great earthquake split the silence. The heavens, which had held their breath since the crucifixion, exhaled in power. A blinding figure, clothed in lightning, descended and rolled away the massive stone, not to let Jesus out, but to let the world in. The guards, stationed to prevent theft, fell as though dead. Their hardened hearts were no match for the presence of the divine. As the women approached the garden tomb, they were met not by the stench of decay, but by an empty space and an angel seated calmly beside it. His voice shattered their fear. "Do not be afraid. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is not here. He is risen. Come, see the place where they laid him." Shock became tears. Tears became trembling. Trembling became a sprint back into the city. Meanwhile, in a hidden room, the disciples still struggled in their doubts. Grief had buried their faith deeper than the tomb. But soon the doors would be knocked upon, not by Roman soldiers, not by Pharisees, but by women breathless with fire in their eyes and one trembling sentence. "The tomb is empty. He is risen." Peter and John raced out of the house, their sandals slapping against the stone. They reached the tomb, Peter entering first, and found only burial cloths neatly folded, and silence echoing louder than words. Jesus was gone. But not in death. In victory. Elsewhere, in another part of the city, Mary Magdalene, who had returned to the tomb alone, stood weeping beside the empty grave. She had seen the angels, but she wanted Jesus. And then, she heard a voice. "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for?" She thought it was the gardener. "Sir, if you've taken him, tell me where you have laid him." Then he said her name. "Mary." And in that instant, the veil lifted. The voice she had heard cast out demons now awakened her heart again. Her tears turned to laughter. Her grief to glory. She cried out, "Rabboni, teacher." And he smiled. "Do not hold on to me," he said gently, "for I have not yet ascended to my Father. But go, tell my brothers." And so the first preacher of the resurrection was a woman once possessed and now made whole. Back in the spiritual realm, chaos turned to terror in the camps of darkness. Death itself began to crumble. The grave, now hollow, had lost its authority. Jesus, the Lamb once slain, had returned as the roaring Lion of Judah. His scars were still visible, but they no longer bled, they blazed. He had descended into the depths and taken the keys of death and hell. Satan, who had celebrated 2 days ago, now stood in the shadows of defeat. Every demon that had rejoiced now cowered at the echo of resurrection. The war was not over, but the outcome was sealed. And so Jesus, now clothed in resurrection glory, began to reveal himself, not to kings, nor to Pharisees, but to his friends. To those who doubted. To those who denied him. To those who had hidden away in shame. He appeared to Cleopas and another on the road to Emmaus, walking with them, speaking gently, unfolding the scriptures until their hearts burned. He broke bread, and in that breaking they saw him. He appeared to the disciples in the upper room, even though the doors were locked. "Peace be with you," he said. "Not judgment. Not rebuke. Just peace." And then he showed them his hands. The same hands that healed lepers, touched eyes, lifted children, and broke bread, now bore the marks of nails. But those wounds were now badges of eternal victory. In that room, hope was reborn. Not hope that he was the Messiah, but confirmation that he was, and is, and will forever be. Moral lessons from the entire Holy Week. 1. Obedience to God opens divine doors. Jesus' humble ride into Jerusalem on a colt, Palm Sunday, teaches us that fulfilling God's instructions, no matter how small, positions us for his glory and purpose. 2. True authority is rooted in righteousness, not titles. When Jesus cleansed the temple and challenged religious hypocrisy, he reminded us that real power lies in spiritual integrity, not religious appearance. 3. God sees the heart, not the outward show. From the fig tree that withered to the widow who gave 2 small coins, we learn that God honors sincere hearts, not loud displays or empty traditions. 4. Betrayal often comes from those closest to us. Judas Iscariot walked with Jesus but still chose darkness. This is a warning and comfort. God is still in control even when we're betrayed. 5. Watch and pray. Temptation comes when we least expect it. In Gethsemane, while Jesus wrestled in prayer, the disciples slept. We must stay spiritually alert and prayerful, especially in our darkest hours. The brief prayer. Lord Jesus, thank you for the journey you took through the Holy Week, for every step of pain, every word of truth, and every act of love. Thank you for facing death so we could have life. Help us to carry these lessons in our hearts. Strengthen our faith, deepen our trust, and remind us that resurrection always follows the cross. May we live boldly for you, knowing that you have already won the victory. In Jesus' name, Amen. If you were touched by this video, kindly share this content with someone who needs it today. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel so you never miss another powerful teaching that can change your life.